My name is Stefaan Verhulst, and I will be the moderator and also presenter of this panel, which will focus on social media data for good. And I'm delighted to be joined with an illustrious panel here. We have Natalia Adler, who runs data collaboratives at UNICEF. We have Berens, who recently became policy head of the data lab that UN-OCHA is setting up in The Hague. And we have Akred, who is the co-founder of Silicon Valley Data Science and is doing, as the term says, doing a lot of interesting work at the edge of data science. But the topic of today is around social media data for public good. And I will start with a few examples by what we mean by social media data for good. And the first example is an example from Facebook, and it's the disaster maps. And Facebook decided about 2 months ago to partner with UNICEF, but also with WFP and with the Red Cross to use their own data, the social media data feed, in order to become smarter about what happens 72 hours post a disaster. As some of you might know, the critical time for making decisions and the critical time to make interventions that can save lives during a disaster period is within the 72 hours following a disaster. And the question is, how can we use social media data, in this context, Facebook data, in order to become smarter? And so they are, at the moment, developing a variety of experiments that ultimately will be able to provide you with density data, population density data, where are people located, so that you actually can target your interventions according to the density of population in a specific area. But also, they will use Facebook data in order to map movements and mobility, and also they will be able to use the safety signals that are being sent using Facebook in order to then locate where are safe zones and where are zones that might be more critical. So that's the first example by which we mean how, which basically illustrates how social media data can be shared for public good. Second example is an example that perhaps you have used, which is Yelp, another social media platform, is starting to use its recommendations, used to share its recommendations in order to also make sense from a public good perspective. And so on a regular basis, they have shared the data through a challenge, the Yelp Data Challenge, that opens up parts of their data for researchers and other teams to look into how can we use recommendations to make sense of, for instance, safety in restaurants, or how can we start using recommendations in order to also start becoming smarter about how small and medium-sized enterprises can actually use social media for their own benefit. Third example is LinkedIn, another social media platform that is developing its own economic graph internally, but is now also starting to share its LinkedIn data with researchers in order to become smarter about skills and the labor market. And so LinkedIn has tried, because LinkedIn is mainly used, of course, quite often for professional purposes, have tried to make sense of the profiles in a manner that can indicate what skills are trending, what skills are necessary for what kind of jobs, and what soft skills are necessary. And so based upon LinkedIn data and based upon some data collaboratives that have been established, they now also have identified the top 5 soft skills that are important moving forward. And then the last example is a total different example, and this is from England, where Sports England at a certain point in time decided and identified that girls are using or are less engaged in sports than boys. And the question was, how can we change the equation? And they started using social media data to really become smarter about what drives girls to engage in sports, what are the limitations, and what are the barriers. And came, as a result of that social media data intelligence, they figured out that there was a lot of fear involved, and that if you really want to communicate with goals around engaging in sports, you really have to position sports in a different way and position it also as a female power kind of positioning. And so those are 4 examples that basically indicate that social media data, which anyway, sometimes we don't realize, is still very nascent. Anyway, this is really from the last 10 years. But social media data is really creating a new kind of intelligence, which we call social media intelligence, by leveraging advanced data science and then engaging on the social media data that is available. And here, to a large extent, we can see that social media can provide an equation between the demand side, becoming smarter about, for instance, disasters, and ultimately the supply side, where you have a huge amount of new social media platforms that are collecting data to a large extent. And so this is the subject of a report, which is, surprise, surprise, called Social Media Intelligence, that we're launching today. And I don't know where Timmy is, but Timmy, where are you? There you are. So Timmy will share some cards where you can download the report. But the report focuses on 12 case studies, and I've shared with you already 2, that try to become smarter about what is social media intelligence, and especially become smarter about how is social media intelligence being used. And based upon that, we're becoming smarter about different kinds of addressing the demand side. And to a large extent, we have identified 5 specific demands that can be addressed using social media data. And the first one is around becoming smarter about the situation. So situational analysis and situational response is a particular value proposition related to social media data, so that you can use social media data to really describe reality in an advanced manner. Second value proposition, or the second demand, is really about knowledge transfer. This is about not just describing reality, but also understanding reality and why certain things happen, right? So this is more about creating explanatory kind of intelligence, such as why are certain elections, for instance, held in the manner that are being held right now. The third one is around public service design, or about design delivery. And here you can use social media data in order to become smarter about how you design interventions. For instance, how do you design economic opportunity interventions, knowing that these are the skill sets that are in high demand, so that you can inform job centers in a better way to address how they go about advising future or job seekers, for instance. The fourth one is around prediction and forecasting, which is really about trying to understand, based upon the models of the past, trying to understand what will happen in the future. And then lastly, impact assessment and evaluation. Once you have an intervention, such as, for instance, the Sports England, once you have an intervention, such as a campaign, how can we become smarter about the buzz around the campaign in order to then adjust the campaign, for instance, in order to make a greater impact. Now, important is that this is not just about sharing data. This is really about creating new kinds of partnerships between those who have the data, because this is totally different, of course, than, for instance, open government data, where there's an assumption that the data is available for free and accessible to all. Now, this is obviously corporate data, sensitive data, and so this requires a new type of public-private partnerships, which we call data collaborative. So the second kind of question that we seek to answer in the report, besides how can social media data be used, is how can it be shared? And here we've identified 6 kind of archetypes of data collaboratives that are emerging by assessing current practice. And it indicates that there is no one way of sharing social media data, but it also indicates that there are different shades of openness with regard to social media data, and there are different shades of collaboration, because each kind of data collaborative is either more open and less collaborative, or less open and more collaborative. And the 6 here are ranging from data pooling or cooperatives, where data is being pooled together and accessed for those that are authorized, to prizes and challenges. I already gave you the example of Yelp, to research partnerships, like for instance the example that we analyzed with MIT and Twitter in order to understand certain kinds of trends in society. Intelligence products, because it's not only quite often where you have access to the data, sometimes it's good enough to just have access to the insights from the data based upon a shared kind of question. To, of course, what some might call nirvana, which is the API model, and then ultimately trusted intermediary. So these are the 6 types of interventions, 6 types of data collaboratives that we discuss in the report. And as I said, there are different shades of openness. Now, the other question then is, of course, and that each time when I talk with people and explain what we try to do is try to understand how we can accelerate sharing of corporate data as an asset that is unfortunately quite often untapped. Then people become, anyway, look at me as if I'm naive, right? And most of the times I am. But of course, why would corporations share their data, right? So what are the incentives and motivations? And so what we've tried to do with this report and with other work that we've done with UNICEF is try to understand what are drivers, what are the incentives behind sharing data. And here we have identified what we call the 6 R's. In fact, there are 7 embedded here. But one, for instance, is about reciprocity, because quite often it's about giving and getting something back. And the getting something back could be other data, through data pools, for instance, where you actually pool data together, and as a result you have data that can be aggregated and can increase insight. But sometimes it's also about having access to intelligence, so that, for instance, working with the UN, you share data or you share your expertise, but then you get also expertise back, insights in countries that are superior because people have been working in those countries for years, or insights in problems that are superior. So these are the 6. One that is interesting from my point of view, and that we've heard a lot, is that corporations are starting to share their data or starting to share the expertise, data science expertise, quite often to retain talent in the corporation. Because it turns out that data scientists are anyway very passionate about creating all kinds of algorithms to improve advertising, but they're also passionate about other things and quite often become frustrated that that is the only passion they can pursue. And so here, working with public interest organizations turns out to be a win-win situation for organizations. And it's important to understand those motivations, because what we see quite often is that the demand side goes to the supply side without understanding what would be a win-win to actually establish a data collaborative, and I think it's important to reflect on that as well. Now, clearly, quite often I'm blamed to be naive because there are, anyway, apparently no incentives for sharing, but obviously there are also risks involved with sharing. And the theme of this conference is about using data responsibly, and clearly sharing corporate data, in this context social media data, has a variety of concerns. Privacy and security is of course the one that comes back all the time and has been already addressed in other places here, so I'm not going to go too far into detail, but also generalizability. I mean, it's not because Facebook has 2 billion users that Facebook represents the world, right? So there are still data invisibles that are not included in the data because they are not using the service. And so how representative is the data in order to then extract insights that are going to be used for public good? So what are the risks involved for actually having certain generalizability and data quality issues? Other concerns are related with competitive concerns, of course. Corporations then quite often, if they start sharing data, they're going to have to start explaining to their investors why they share the data, which is being seen as a competitive edge, right? And so sharing the data might be seen as actually giving the data to your competitors, and hence there might be huge concerns within corporations. And then last but not least, cultural challenges as well. I mean, in the past, I did a lot of work around information sharing in government, and there I always said no one has been promoted for sharing data, unfortunately, and the same thing in corporations, right? So it's not in the cultural mindset to see this yet as positive, as saying, yes, you went the extra line. Quite often it's the opposite. You're getting fired by sharing data, and that's the fear that it actually is present in many corporations, which then is an inhibitor to doing more of that kind of work. Now, how to address that? We have called on numerous occasions for a data responsibility approach, and basically there are three components that we see needs to be established in order to really unlock social media data. One is, of course, principles and processes, and so we are delighted that Bloomberg and their colleagues are starting this effort to starting establishing principles, because frankly, anyone who has worked on data sharing knows that the existing principles of fair information practices that were established about 30 years ago by the OECD clearly are out of date, because those principles start from the assumption that you only use the data for the purpose it was collected. And guess what? Everything I talk about is about secondary use, right? And so how do we deal with new principles that allow for secondary use in the public interest? And we need principles, we need new processes, and here we actually need to innovate the processes. We cannot just spend more time in closed rooms by the same people we already know. We need to open up those processes for making principles. Risk and value assessment, clearly we need to assess what the risk might be across the data value chain, starting from collection to analysis, to sharing, to ultimately also the use. And so we need to become smarter about that, but we need to turn that into decision trees so that it's not a long-term or longish process, but it actually is embedded in how you're going to go about data. But as I always said, clearly you have to try to do no harm, but sometimes using no data might be harmful as well. And so we have to be also smarter about what is the opportunity cost of not using the data, right? How many lives are not saved because we don't share the data? And so we also have to, as we make risk assessment with the data, we have to also make an assessment of the value that is embedded so that we can become smarter about the real trade-off, if such a thing exists. And then methods and technologies. Here, just one, we actually have to develop also a method to define the problem better. Because quite often data is being used without really understanding the problem, and as a result comes with all kinds of insights, but it doesn't really help the problem as such. Let me end here by saying that there is a movement, and anyway, we can see people in this room is already an indication of the movement to use data for good, but it's going to be hard to really make this systemic and sustainable. And there are really four elements that, building blocks that needs to be in place. One, we need to professionalize the supply side, by which I mean it's not like they are amateurs, by which I mean is that we need to have really data stewards on the supply side, on the social media side. Anyone here in the room who has tried to get access to social media data probably has had a hard time figuring out who to talk to, right? There is no, quite often, designated person. Of course, we have Gideon and Bloomberg, but in other places, it's very hard to even understand who you should talk to and who can sign off with regard to sharing data. So we need to have a data stewardship kind of function. We need new methods, as already mentioned, both methods of intake, both methods of actually then assessing the data, because still the science is there, but we can do better. We need evidence of what works. There's a lot of hype around data, and I always say, surprisingly, we are actually not data-driven when it comes to data or using data. So we need to become more data-driven about using data, and we need to become smart about what's the impact and how can we improve the impact of using data moving forward. And last but not least, we need this movement. And so this movement is here, but it needs to become a bigger movement that both on the demand side to ask for access to this asset that is out there in a responsible manner, but also on the supply side. So with that, I'm gonna stop the presentation. I probably went over time. You can download the report here, but I've invited 3 people that have worked on many of those aspects to share their thoughts and also reflect on how does social media intelligence play a role within your organization, or how should we reflect on it? Natalia, why don't we start with you? So why don't you tell a little bit what you do at UNICEF, and then also how does social media data and unlocking social media data, how does it fit within your mandate and mission?
Well, thank you, Stefaan. Good morning, everybody. It's still morning, right? It's Sunday, I know, sorry. But my name is Natalia Adler, and I work for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. And we have this tiny little mission at UNICEF, which is to advance the rights of children, every child, everywhere. And in our pursuit in that mission, we have to deal with many problems, from all the humanitarian crises that you see on TV, to refugee crisis, climate change, urbanization, poverty. Those are not simple problems, as you can imagine. And the best way that I can think of to describe how complex these are is to think that they are as complex as raising a child. How many of you here have children? Raise your hands. Well, not quite. No. It's good for us. Not a lot of work for UNICEF then. But you know, it's yeah, maybe you have children in 1 year. But if you have a child, you know that nothing prepares you for what it's like to have one, right? It doesn't come with recipes or instructions. And the same thing applies to these complex problems that we're dealing with. Sometimes what works in one country does not work in another country. And in our 70 years of existence, we have learned two things in dealing with these complex problems. First, it takes a village. You cannot do it alone. Therefore, you need these kind of collaborations. Two, you need data. You need data to unpack those complex problems, to make them more actionable. Otherwise, they are too complex and you can't do anything. And some of the data that we can use to make those problems a little bit more actionable comes from social media. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, you all remember the Zika outbreak in Brazil. And our office there started doing something that we normally do in this kind of situations. It was to launch a campaign to raise awareness about the symptoms, what people had to do in that kind of situation to prevent Zika. And they did it also in the sort of traditional fashion that we normally do. A little bit of shooting in the dark, producing these amazing materials, but then just throwing it out there and crossing their fingers and hoping that that will target the intended audience. But that time around, they also did something a little bit different. They reached out to Facebook and asked, can you help? And Facebook did. They did not share the data. They did the analysis themselves, but they shared the insights with UNICEF in Brazil. And one of the interesting insights that came out of that experience was that for some reason, I still don't know why, but for some reason, a lot of men, or males in general, were the most active on Facebook talking about Zika. They were like the biggest disseminator of Zika information on Facebook. So with that information in real time, UNICEF Brazil was able to pivot its campaign and it really target men and boys and male teenagers so that they could maximize the campaign efforts. And indeed, they were able to increase the scope of that work. But of course, not every time, as Stefaan said, you can knock on the door on Facebook and you know who to talk to and they will actually listen to you. So that was like a particular example. So what do you do when you don't have that access? So that's why the Data Collaboratives framework also works really well in those situations. It also happens that in Brazil, for some reason, the examples are in Brazil, and I'm Brazilian, by the way, but I swear there is a coincidence here. But the UNICEF office in Brazil was launching just a few months ago a campaign to bring awareness about the number of C-sections in the country. Brazil has the second highest rate of C-sections in the world, and the situation is only getting worse. In the 1970s, it used to be like 15% of births were delivered through C-sections. Today, it's 56%. And in private hospitals, it can go up to 90%. So they really wanted to create this massive communication campaign to bring awareness about the benefits of natural labor and the risks of C-sections. And in that particular time, we did not have the opportunity to knock on Facebook's door. But we define the problem, which is very, very real, and Stefaan has mentioned the importance of really articulating the problem really well. And then we launched to data scientists around the world. And we have been working with the ISI Foundation in Italy, and Michele is here today, and they really jumped on that opportunity. We can try to help. We don't know exactly what we're going to do, but we can try to help. And we created an ontology of keywords in close partnership with the social media experts in the UNICEF Brazil to see what are those keywords that we can then extract from Twitter, we can extract from Facebook. And again, there were many insights from that experience. I'm not going to extend too much, but one of them that I thought was quite revealing is that we were able to, again, in a similar case as with UNICEF, with Facebook, we're able to identify micro-influencers who had already reached a certain level of audience, that all the UNICEF Brazil had to do was tap on those micro-influencers. And we saw that in that particular case for C-section and natural labor, you know what the most effective campaigns or tweets or posts are? They're related to actually home videos of people having natural births. And that was such an amazing experience, and people were tweeting that sometimes 500,000 times. And that, by knowing that, our office in Brazil could then piggyback on those people to then send the message and reach many more people. So I think that's two examples of one, when you knock on the door and you're working with the corporation directly, but you also can do that, as you all know, through APIs and by bringing many people together. But I think the centrality here, you really, really needed to define the problem well.
Great, thanks, Natalia. From home birds to Joss. So Joss, no pressure here. We are going to have a video at the end. So Joss, you tell us a little bit about the data lab, and also HDX. Some might not know what it means, but it's a data collaborative. But then specifically, share us your thoughts about the data responsibility components of all.
Will do. Thank you, Stefaan, and thanks, Natalia. So my name is Berens, and I work as Data Policy Officer at the Center for Humanitarian Data in The Hague, which was recently established by UN-OCHA. That's the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and our mandate is really to support disaster response by coordinating the relief effort between various UN organizations or other humanitarian partners. And one of the ways we do that is, since 2014, we've launched, as Stefaan mentioned, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is an open data platform that allows organizations to put up the data they collect or have collected about a disaster area and share it with their partners, so that we don't have to go and collect, do surveys, go for field visits, and collect all the data again and again, but rather can benefit from each other's work. So that data, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, has been operational since 2014, and by now we have over 300 organizations on there sharing. I believe we're almost at 6,000 data sets. And so the type of data that was traditionally shared on the platform, you can imagine, is not the big data that some of these panels might be talking about. It's small data collected by humanitarian agencies. So let's say UNICEF might have gone out to do a survey about a certain area. They can upload that data on the platform. But lately, we've started to see that there's also this immense value in tapping into other types of data streams, right? Be it social media data that we're discussing today, but also other data from the private sector. So you can think of financial transaction records, where people have swiped their credit cards, or call detail records, where people have made their phone calls or sent a text giving their location. Obviously, there's a whole range of privacy and other ethical and legal considerations around that, but there is a value there that's worth exploring. And so one of the actions we've undertaken there is to, instead of allowing people only to share their data fully publicly on our platform, to share the existence of their data. So to put online metadata by which other actors in a response can see who's been collecting what, and then reach out to them and request the full data set. So that is on the data collaboratives examples that Stefaan was mentioning. It's another shade of open, if you will, right? So you don't have to go fully public to share the value of data. Now, we're talking about social media data here, and Stefaan asked me to go a bit into the data responsibility side of that and some of the risks and concerns that are specific to social media data. And I think one of the key misconceptions about social media data is that since a lot of it is public, it's harmless, right? It's already out there. And that's not really the case, right? So even though data might be on all of these websites somewhere on the internet, there is a new piece of information that gets created by presenting it in a certain way. So Stefaan mentioned there are these data invisibles that might not be represented in the data. That can lead to the wrong decision being taken in the middle of a response, right? So it's crucial to not think of social media data as just something that's public and can therefore be used by anyone at any time. And there's a parallel there with, I don't know if you all remember or have known at some point about a case between Google and a guy in Spain who wanted to see some search results about him removed from the index that Google produced. So a lot of people said that, well, his data is somewhere on the internet, right? And so therefore, why can't Google index it or show it? But no one would ever find this data. So the data about this man was that he at some point had defaulted on a loan and that had been made public, and therefore he now couldn't get a loan anymore easily. No one would have found that data were it not for Google putting it very high up in their index. So even though the data was already public, what Google did to that data gave it another sort of status, right? And it's a similar risk that you could see in using social media data. So it's crucial to be aware of that. Another point about data responsibility, maybe more in general, is that even though collaboration between an organization like UNICEF or WFP or OCHA and the private sector to harness the value of this data is important, there's another key stakeholder there, and that's the data subject. So for a lot of the examples that are in this great and very timely report of GovLabs and UNICEF, the situation that the data relates to, that's being shared, or of which the value is being shared, is quite a sensitive situation, can be quite fragile, and it's critical to include the voice of those people that will be affected by decision-making based on that data. And that's a very hard thing to do, and I'm not saying I have the answer to how to do that, but including that voice and being aware of inclusiveness in decision-making around the use of data is very important. So I invite you all to come have a look at our Center for Humanitarian Data in The Hague, or if you're not traveling there anytime soon, visit our website, which is center.humdata.org. But yeah, so John.
Thank you very much. And John, so we've had the good side, the challenging side, and where do you fit in from a scientific point of view?
The profitable side. My mission is to make more money for my investors, which is the mission of the vast majority of people working professionally in the data science field out there, right? But somehow I managed to use social media for good in there. So I'll start with a little story. Our massive strategic goal of using social media data at Silicon Valley Data Science is about employee retention, and more specifically getting them to work on time so that we can do better work. If you're familiar with the Bay Area, public transit there is problematic, to put it very politely. And the train runs very erratically. And so one of the things that you can do when you have a team of data scientists, and your job is to understand the various technologies and techniques you can put into use, and if you're one of these people like me, I encourage you to do this, is if you have to evaluate some arbitrary technology to decide if Spark is fast enough and I can run the right machine learning model on it, take some public data and do something and say something useful with it. So we were playing around, and one of the things we decided to do was try and understand what made the train late, because the train was often late, and it really drove dramatically down the usage of public transportation on my team, and that I think generalizes quite well to the Bay Area. It's also the case that in the Bay Area, lots of people don't go to, have like 2-3 hour commutes to get to their jobs because of the housing cost and the concentration of expensive housing where the jobs are, and cheap housing where the jobs aren't. So if you can relieve congestion, you can actually make employment more accessible to people. You can get them home to their families quicker and a bunch of good things. But really, I just wanted to get my employees to show up to work on time. And what we did was, it turns out that if your train is having a bad day, the people tweet. And Twitter is a nice source in that it is essentially inherently public, right? So I don't have to actually go ask anybody's permission to use that data to do what I was trying to do with it. We just have to listen to the Twitter fire hose and look for hashtag Caltrain and find out when it's had a bad day. And that turns out to be a really important signal amongst a bunch of other signals if you're seeking to understand the performance of the rail system in the Bay Area. So that allowed us to basically build models that would say, okay, the train has clearly had an incident. Maybe we should just turn our train schedule app into an Uber button or a Lyft button so people can find another way home. So that's a simple example to say that that data was easily accessible. It contained a signal that was useful to do something good in the world that was fairly easy to come by. That when we combined with other publicly accessible data, our office was physically on the train tracks, so we have a camera pointing at the trains, watching it go by. We have microphones, we listen to the trains go by and all the rest of it, to better understand how that system operates through a bunch of ways that are basically using social data, whether that social data is on a social media platform or it's a bunch of people going by in a bus. All of these are ways to use social media data to answer questions. And what's hard about using social media data to answer questions is challenges of accessibility, whether it's due to volume, right? So part of the reason Facebook can't just give data to everybody that asks is because it's heavy. They've got tons of it. They can't just be like, all right, here you go. Here's a thumb drive. See what the peoples have been tweeting or have been posting about. But it's also, to your point, it's also a lot of fears of competitive pressure and things like that. And I think that one of the most important things we can do, and to the movement point Stefaan was making, is teach companies and the for-profit world to think of what they're doing with data and the efforts to use it for social outcomes as an obligation rather than a luxury. And I'll use an anecdote to motivate this idea, but because we've been talking a lot about pregnancies this morning. And we learned earlier this morning from the gentleman from Microsoft, prenatal care and the proper vitamins for expectant mothers can make a dramatic impact on outcomes for childbirth. So let's say you're a company that has the ability to sense what people buy. And if people start buying things, you might be able to sense that they are pregnant, right? Target, if you're not familiar with this story, famously did this a few years ago and predicted pregnancy and then sent out incentives for people to go buy those prenatal vitamins, diapers, and the rest of it. And they sent one of those advertisements to the single father of a teenage daughter who was pregnant, and the father did not know. You can just imagine how pleasant an afternoon that was at the homestead, and Target got a lot of flack for this. Now imagine a world where Target says, you know, this was an unintended consequence of a well-intended marketing campaign. It's an outgrowth of our work that we've been doing to understanding buying behavior of people and how that relates to pregnancy and outcomes. You know, we've saved 150,000 children's lives this year by better penetrating the world with neonatal vitamins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They would have been in a much better spot. So I would encourage and have encouraged the Targets of the world to think of this from a much different perspective, which is managing risk. Sharing data mitigates risk as well as potentially invites risk. And that risk mitigation can be very, very powerful. And so, I advise a lot of companies on what their data strategy should be to to meet their institutional ambitions. And what I like to tell them is you should devote some time to thinking about how what you see in the world, your privileged visibility into the world, can drive social outcomes as well as commercial ones for your company. Cynically, I need to motivate them because they have shareholders and stuff. And by the way, this will help you make more money and mitigate your risk. But also, it's just the right thing to do.
Great, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for the panel. So I think you've heard from different angles both the potential but also the challenges of social media intelligence. And I think we have about 5 minutes for any Q&A that might be here in the room. Otherwise, I will pose some questions to the panelists. But are there any questions, any reactions from the audience? So let's go over there, and then there's one here.
Thank you. Working with communities, if you want to integrate the social media data into a platform, the fear and resistance that the members of the communities have, particularly challenges around a sense of surveillance and intruding into their private thinking, and any recommendations you have for how to increase sort of the receptivity of the community members to it.
Does anyone want to address that? No, yeah, I think that's anyway, to a large extent. So so no one wants to. So I will put my head out and have it chopped. But I think that's a real important statement. I think there are challenges on the supply side, and there are clearly challenges on the also on the demand side. And to a large extent, especially with what is going on right now, there's quite often a stigma, indeed, attached to social media data, and it could be a stigma ranging from this will turn into a data variance kind of society, which is a very valid concern. But I think there are ways to deal with those concerns, both with the level of transparency about what is the data that is going to be used, but also dealing with those kinds of assessments that John and Josh were talking about, assessments with regard to what are the risks at the collection stage, for instance, right? So ranging from, is the data collected appropriately? What does it mean to be appropriately? But also, what are the risks if you don't start using the data with regard to certain kinds of community objectives? And then at least you will have a more informed kind of debate about how do you go about using this kind of asset? Because this is how we quite often GovLab looks at how do you start untapping certain assets that technology has provided us for public good. And so data is clearly an asset, but unfortunately, quite often not easily, as was meant, easily available, and quite often for good reasons. But the question is, how do you start? How does the community start to think in terms of data as an asset for their objectives, and have then an informed debate about how do you scale the assets versus the risks with regard to starting to use those things. Yeah. Any other reactions to that? Or let's take another question.
The question that I had, it was pretty uniform across all of you guys' conversation, is this value that data has, the competitive advantage that it adds. And my question was, do you see sort of a data monetization system being created to sort of give a quantified value of how impactful data sets can be in the future?
Oh boy, how long you got? So I've done a lot of work on data valuation. The problem is that the value that data brings to a decision goes through several levels of refinement. And we don't have open markets, right? So if we do the oil analogy, oil is a commodity. You can make a bunch of stuff out of it. That stuff has varying value, but oil is the input. The reason you can then value oil is because there's a public market, or at least a visible market, where it trades and you can see the price of what's happening. Data is not uniform enough as an input to value it as a commodity on the one hand, and there's no transparent market to see if people are buying it, how much they're paying for it, and things like that. And then the impact stories and the understanding of the value data contributes to outcomes, while improving is still fairly fuzzy. So all the things that you need to do that are still very nascent. That said, I run around, I talk to a bunch of CTOs, CIOs, chief something that has to do with data officers in large organizations who would very much like to value it because they see it as a means to attract investment and curation and all the rest. So quantifying the actual value opportunity of data is a difficult thing, but you can, so here's the substitute. Let's talk about a bunch of use cases, understand the impacts that they were able to have, and while maybe we can't put a dollar figure on it from a formula, we can start to understand how the mechanisms of value work and use that as guide. So while we can't put a number on it, we can say a lot of things about how to invest in data to make value realization easier. And then how to make it more discoverable so that you can, when you have a problem that if you solve it, you can achieve some value, you can discover that data, because that's we all know what we put into Facebook, but we don't know what Facebook knows, and we might be disturbed if we found out in some cases.
Great, Natalia, you want to react to something?
It's time.
It's time, but I think people probably can wait a little bit before going to lunch to hear from Natalia.
Of course.
And then we're going to watch that video.
I completely agree with John, but I would say, this is a lot of trial by error. So we are learning, and the best way to do that is through these case studies. And that's what we're trying to show, the benefits of doing this together. And if we can do that, and I think you're right, I think we have to go the extra mile and trying to monetize that, because a lot of conversations that we have with organizations, particularly corporations, when it comes to what is called data philanthropy, they're very willing to donate money. Well, not always, but they're very willing to donate money. But when it comes to donating data, it becomes like nobody actually knows how to do it. It's not even like that there isn't a willingness not to do it, but how do you make that happen? And what is it that is going to accomplish? So I think you're right. I think that as we learn from this, we should try to put a price tag to that, because I think the conversation becomes easier.
Great, John.
So since we're over time anyway, I'm also going to take just 1 minute, which sort of responds to both of your questions. I think so the value of data, it's important for organizations like ours to know that, and for the private sector to be aware of that value, but also for data subjects, right? And for people on whom the data is being collected. And in that sense, data literacy, so awareness, raising awareness of what data is being collected, what can be done with it, especially in some of the communities that we work with, is a critical thing. Also to, per your question, sort of involve them more in the discussion at an informed level. Sorry, that was final.
Great. Yeah, well, we are indeed out of time, and I would like to have everyone join me in thanking the panelists. And please do check out the report if you're interested, and especially share with us your ideas, your reactions, your comments, positive, negative, so that we can really engage in a conversation. Because I do believe that this is going to be, as we said, the new kind of public-private partnerships that we really have to become smarter about. And it's also about how do we leverage an asset that is there, and we can have all kinds of debate what the value might be, but how do we start unlocking that asset for good? So thanks, everyone, for being here, and I think lunch is probably served right now. Thank you.
Thank you.